Hello. It's been a long time, but I just got the chess bug again recently, and last night I went to the OTB Chess Club in Fitchburg, Mass, and played a game. It was the fourth round of their tournament, and I had the white pieces against a gentleman I've never played before named Michael David. The OTB Chess Club lists him as having a rating of 1507, and I think mine was 2120 something going into this game. I played d4. He played knight f6, c4, d6, knight c3, g6, and now after e4, bishop g7, we've arrived at clearly an opening most of us know as the King's Indian defense. I played bishop e2, which is a pretty flexible move, and black played c6. I was expecting castle kingside, which is normal here, but black played c6, kind of giving his queen the ability to come out to the queen side if it wants to. And in fact, after bishop g5, black played queen a5. I guess this is the first move of black's that I'll criticize. I think black should be more concerned with getting his king to safety and with developing his queenside minor pieces than with the activation of his queen. It creates a couple of threats. Queen takes g5 is threatened, obviously, as is knight takes e4, because the knight on c3 is pinned. But both of these threats can be dealt with a developing move from white, queen d2. And now that those threats have been dealt with, the question is, what is black's queen doing on a5? Castle kingside from black, and h4. And the idea here is just to play h5, maybe take on g6 and launch a kingside attack with bishop h6, a trade on g7, and then queen h6. Probably have to remove this knight somehow, but maybe that can be accomplished with a later e5. And an attack on the wing is best met with a counterattack in the center, and Michael played e5, so that's very principled. I played d5. I think here an opening of the center would not be good for white, because it would make this wing attack look silly. So I played d5. Mike traded on d5, c takes d5, c takes d5. It was pretty obvious to me that I should play c takes d5 and not e takes d5, because e takes d5 will allow a later f5 when black will be controlling all sorts of important central and kingside squares. So c takes d5 and queen b4. If I were black here, I'd be trying to put this knight on c5. And you can do that through the a6 square or through d7. And I'd be trying to figure out what to do with my light squared bishop. Let's get rid of some of these arrows. It's not really possible to put the bishop on g4, because that'll drop a piece to bishop takes f6. But you could do something like b6 maybe, and bishop a6 as a way of activating it. That's dangerous for the black queen, which will then not have a route back out of the queen side and might for that reason get trapped. But this is at least an idea for black's development. What black played, though, is queen b4. And this is another queen move that I don't agree with. I mean, it was the move I was worried about in this position, but that's just because once black plays it, I have to calculate some tactics. But it's another queen move, and it can be responded to with a pretty natural move from white that slightly improves, I think, slightly improves his position, a3. And the reason I didn't really want to calculate this is that black here can play the move queen d4, after which, if I trade on d4 and black recaptures with his e-pawn, I can play knight b5, hitting the c7 square and the d6 pawn. But black can play knight takes e4, hitting my queen and my bishop on g5. And those calculations looked pretty complicated to me. But he didn't play queen d4. Oh, and by the way, the reason he played queen b4 to begin with is to put more pressure on e4. So a3, he played queen back to a5. And unless his idea is that me playing a3 weakens the b3 square and that he's going to take advantage of that later on, this queen b4 to a5 maneuver is not a good idea because it allows white to get the move a3 for free plus a move of his choice. I chose to use that move to play h5 and continue with a kingside attack. Alright, and this during the game I thought Black's next couple of moves I thought were mistakes, but they turned out to allow him to defend his kingside pretty well. So I have to give Black credit for, I guess, for having had the better ideas in this situation. As things stand with the rook on f8, White would like to launch some kind of kingside attack. As I mentioned earlier, White might play bishop h6, there might be a trade on g6, there might be a trade on g7, and the white queen and white rook hopefully will have a field day on the black king side. And so seeing this, Mike played rook e8. It looks a little weird because after I played h takes g6, he played f takes g6. And I thought at this point that this must be bad. Black removes his rook from the f-file and then causes the f-file to be half open. But I think the more important issue here is that Black's king now has two more escape squares than it had before, making checkmate very unlikely. I think that turned out to help Black, at least in the short term, though in the long run, the fact that the 7th rank is vulnerable is a big issue for Black. Okay, knight h3. I think the computer wanted knight b5 here when it doesn't make sense for Black to trade on d2, because then he can't defend both d6 and c7. I didn't see that though, so I played knight h3, developing my last minor piece. And if we compare the pieces at this point, I think it's pretty clear that White has an advantage. Black has 4 developed pieces. White has 5, actually 6, because this rook's helping out on the h-file, and it's only one move to get this last rook into the game. Okay, I think my opponent here was realizing that there might be some danger on the king side, so he wanted to bring his queen back into the game to have it help out, and maybe even to have it end up, let's get rid of these, to have it end up on f7 and a rook on f8 when f2 might be an issue for me. But the move he chose, which is queen c7, strikes me as another not very good queen move. Here is maybe another opportunity for Black to stay in the game by developing his minor pieces, trying to put this knight on c5, although now, as long as the rook on a1 is protected, b4 is going to be an issue, and to develop this bishop somehow, possibly by just trading it off for the knight on h3. Instead he played queen c7, and this walks right into a developing move from White, rook c1. And now White's threatening knight b5, after which knight c7 will fork the rooks on a8 and e8. And this is a critical moment in the game. I think my opponent, Mike, realized that knight a6 was a way for him to try to develop his minor pieces. That's a good idea. The problem, though, is that it allows White to initiate a series of tactics that hopefully will win him material. After bishop takes a6, b takes a6. There are options here. I was looking at bishop takes f6, and I was looking at knight b5. Knight b5 is a double attack on the black queen, which can be followed up with knight c7. And the reason I was thinking about playing bishop takes f6 first is that otherwise, in some variation, once White's knight leaves c3, Black's knight may capture on e4, forking the white queen and dark squared bishop. But I realized, and I'm not going to go over all of the tactical variations that I saw here, mostly because I can't remember them. But I'll show you at least an idea of how complicated this is. Bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, with the idea that I'm removing Black's attacker on the e4 square, followed by knight b5, allows Black to play queen e7, after which knight c7 forks Black's two rooks. But Black can play bishop takes h3, removing a defender of the g5 square, and after rook takes h3, he can play bishop to g5, skewering the white queen and rook and recovering his exchange. So I did not want to just trade a bunch of pieces, which would lessen the trouble black has defending his position. So instead of bishop takes f6, I played knight b5. Yeah, and Michael chose the d7 square for his queen. This is a pretty tricky situation for black, because he has to decide where to place the queen. I don't think it's a reasonable idea to trade the queen for a rook and a knight in this situation. Usually if you're going to do that, you have to have a pawn or two for it, and you have to be in a situation in which you don't have a lot of weaknesses, because otherwise the queen will just kind of excuse me, target multiple things and you'll be in trouble. So the black queen has to move. She can move to b6, b8, b7, d8, d7, e7, or f7. And it's not easy to figure out which squares are good. One obvious thing, I think, is that b7 and f7 are no good, as the knight will capture on d6 with an exchange winning fork. But beyond that, I'm not really sure what black should have done. If the black queen shows up on b6, there might be pressure on f2 and b2, but it might not be as close to the kingside action as it wants to be. Whereas if it sits on d8 or e7, it's pinned, it causes the knight on f6 to be pinned by the bishop on g5. And if it goes to d7, as in the game, it blocks the light-squared bishop's ability to take on h3, which might be important for black. Okay, I could play knight c7 here, but I was a little bit afraid, as I mentioned earlier, of knight takes e4. I think the computer likes this and says that after knight takes e4, white should simply play queen e3 and eventually win an exchange. But I was having trouble calculating this, so I decided to play bishop takes f6. And this gives black two options. One is to retake on f6, when black has two bishops for two knights, which is good, except that white plays knight c7 and wins an exchange. But then might be a better practical idea than what my opponent went for, which was a takes b5, because this allows white to trade off dark squared bishops. Bishop takes g7. The king can't take back because knight g5 can lead to a rook showing up on h7 or the knight showing up on e6. So he has to take back with the queen. And I just thought that in this position, if we compare the pieces, the white queen is better than the black queen. This white rook is better than either of the black ones. This knight is not great right now, but once it hits g5, it'll be helping to create serious threats against the black king. And this rook is active along the h-file. So both of white's rooks are better than both of black's rooks. The white queen is better, and the minor pieces maybe are about the same, but white's has a lot of potential. And that should mean that white has a significant advantage here. I played rook c6, attacking the d-pawn. He played rook d8 to defend it, and I jumped in with knight g5. And this brings us to an important decision for black. White is threatening rook h7, and the only way for black to do anything about that is to move the pawn. But should he move it to h6 or to h5? h6 initiates tactical complications because white can play knight e6, and after bishop takes e6, d takes e6, there is potential trouble on h6 and on d6. But if, as in the game, black plays h5, this knight has effectively an outpost on g5. As long as it's protected by the white queen, it will never be captured because only the black queen can attack it. A rook can never show up on f5 or it'll be lost, and the light squared bishop can't attack that square. Alright, and now that the h-pawn is moved, and there's not really anything for this rook to do on the h-file anymore, I castled, got the king safer, and got ready to activate the rook again on the c-file. Here I think black has to do something about his development. He has to find a way to activate this bishop. maybe bishop to b7, though that has the downside of allowing knight e6. In fact, knight e6 might win on the spot. Black has to move the queen, and then knight takes d8 will force black to recapture on d8, because if he takes on c6, the knight will retake there, and white will be up significant material. And if he tries to activate the bishop on d7, there might just be rook c7, then some rook to the c-file, rook c1, a trade on c7, another rook to c8, the queen coming back to c1, a trade on c7, but at that point we'd actually, let me just show you that. But at this point I think it's obvious that white is better. The white queen is significantly better than the black queen, and the white minor piece is better than the black one. And the black king is exposed. So I don't really have a solution for black, but I'm confident that this move h4, well, I can't really say it's not a good idea, because black has to find counterplay somehow. So maybe it's okay. I played rook fc1, intending rook c7, followed by some rook move along the 7th rank, followed by doubling, which should cause the win of the queen or the death of the black king. He played queen f6, anticipating rook c7. I played rook c7 anyway, and he played rook f8. Alright, so now the move that jumps out at us, I think, is knight h7, forking the queen on f6 and the rook on f8. But as it turns out, that doesn't win material. After knight h7, there's queen f4, and I don't have time to take the rook on f8 because I'll lose my queen on d2. So the question when looking at the move knight h7 is not, do I want to win an exchange? It's, do I want to trade queens? And if we go back to this position, I think the way to decide this, well, computers will tell you absolutely one way or the other, but the way I decided this during the game was to think about king safety. I think with the queens on the board, both kings are in some danger. In fact, if black can break open the white pawn structure somehow, maybe white's king can be in danger as serious as the danger the black king is in. But without the queens, white's king is in no danger, while black's is still going to be the victim of these rooks on the 7th rank. So I thought, okay, I'll trade queens. Knight h7, queen f4, queen takes f4, rook takes f4. Now the idea was rook e7, just intending to double on the 7th rank and cause problems for black and win a pawn or deliver checkmate. I think black here has to play rook f7. He can't allow two rooks on the 7th, at which point he will not have a way to oppose them. And the result would be something like rook takes f7, king takes f7, rook c7 check, when the black king has to go backwards because both of these squares are covered. And white has all sorts of targets to attack with his pieces, but at least black has hope here. But instead black played h3. And unlike when the queens were on the board, in this position, this move doesn't really come with a threat. I guess it has a minor threat, which is that if black could make another move and play h2 check, and if white took that pawn, then rook h4 check, followed by rook takes h7, would trade material. It wouldn't even win the knight on h7 because white could play rook e8 check, followed by one capture or the other on c8. Okay, I played rook cc7 after h3, and this is big trouble for black. h2 check. Before there was a problem with taking on h2, but not anymore. Rook h4 check doesn't do anything. And so bishop g4. And I should point out that white here is threatening rook e8 check, and then after rook f8, rook takes f8 is checkmate. Bishop g4. Now the rook is guarding e8, and black is developing his pieces. Good move. Okay, so here, maybe you can take this as a little bit of a tactics quiz if you want. What should white do to continue with the attack and either mate the black king or win material? I think the way to get to an answer there is to realize that black has certain weaknesses in his position, in particular the g6 pawn and the e6 square, and the d6 pawn. And if you could attack a couple of those, you're probably going to win. You're probably either going to get even better pieces or you're going to win something. And white, with that in mind, might like to play knight f8 with the idea that if a rook recaptures, the result is checkmate. But the problem is that the king can take on f8 instead. So I threw in rook g7 check with the idea that it'll scare away the black king, and then I played knight f8. And in fact here, white's not threatening a fork, he's threatening checkmate. Black here has to, I think, give up material by defending the g6 pawn with his rook, because if he defends with bishop h5, as in the game, he guards g6, but he gives up e6. And after knight e6, I no longer need a rook to take on f8 because my knight is guarding that square. And now the threat of rook h7 followed by rook g7 is unstoppable. David played rook h4 check, king g3, and then he played g5. I played rook h7 check, and in light of the fact that white has made one more move, he resigned. Alright, I hope to be back next week with my 5th round game, and my overall goal is to try to get back above 2200, though I don't know if I can do that again. Anyway, thanks a lot.